So first, I want to welcome everybody to the Wisconsin Women in Conservation Summer Series kickoff for 2022. This is our second webinar of the summer. We again want to welcome everybody. We're so glad that you're here today. I've covered some of these things, so we'll move on to the next piece. To start, I want to take some space to do a land acknowledgement. We are here today to support each other as we work to care for and steward the land. And part of that process is understanding the history of how we ended up on this land, who is displaced from this land, and what our place is within that history. I want us to remember that our land acknowledgement embraces both an awareness of past injustices and a recognition of ongoing efforts. We are all coming from different places in Wisconsin, but the space where I live occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation. I would like us to take a moment to reflect on what land acknowledgements mean to you. And as you continue to reflect moving forward, I encourage you to educate yourself on the current efforts of First Nation people where you are. If you are interested in some resources, we can also share those out after with you. WiWiC is a 3-year project. It's a partnership between 5 different organizations, and we are all working in different parts of the state. As you can see, we have some counties that are highlighted here. These are the areas where we will be holding in-person events, but we welcome anybody from across the state. We've had people from Minnesota even join some of these webinars, but if you're willing to drive to our events, we would love to have you there. We are working to build connections between women farmers and landowners through workshops and field days, providing conservation education and helping to create plans for conservation across the land. Right now, we are in year 2 of our project, and we have a number of really great events for the rest of this year, as well as a full lineup for this next, or kind of the third year of our project. So we're really looking forward to continuing this great work. We have a couple of really great events coming up, so I want to quickly highlight those. First is that July 18th, the week of July 18th, is our week where we are celebrating women educators, and we are holding up regional gatherings. And so if you are an educator who works with women landowners or farmers doing conservation work, we invite you to join us at these events, and you can find them on our website. This is number 2 of 4 summer camp webinars that we'll be hosting. Our third one is on Thursday, July 28th, and we will be talking about woodlands. And so if you are interested in that, we encourage you to register for that. Or if you know anybody who is has woodlands and is interested in kind of learning more and how to develop a plan for your trees or their trees, we encourage you to register for that. We have a great lineup of summer field days. This is a really cool opportunity to go to somebody's land and see what they have done on the land itself, and to meet with other women who are doing work and interested in the same things that you're interested in. So if you are in one of these areas or you would like to go to one of these events, you can register for those on our website. We have a new podcast, and the 3rd episode has just come out. That is on the blog on our website. This last one was with Marcy Hess, and it was the Driftless Prairies blog. And so we would love for you to check that out. Okay, so that is my little quick overview of our WiWiC project. And at this point, I am excited to turn it over to Alicia Rosby and to Deirdre Birmingham.
Hi, everyone. It delights me to introduce Deirdre Birmingham today. Deirdre holds multiple degrees in agriculture and is the owner of the Cider Farm in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, where she offers seasonal orchard tastings and also has the cidery and tasting room on Madison's west side near Watts Road. Deirdre has enhanced the pollinator habitat at her certified organic property by planting a 30-acre prairie, putting prairie strips around the orchard, adding milkweed seeds for monarchs, alternating the mowing in alleyways so every row is flowering, and enhancing beneficial insect populations. She uses certified organic products and is leaving the dandelions alone. Today, we have a very special opportunity to hear more about the efforts that she is putting in forth, that things that Deirdre finds important in bringing pollinator biodiversity to her farm. So Deirdre, can you please begin by telling us, to introduce yourself and tell us the story of your land and farm?
Yeah, sure. And Kirsten, feel free to throw up a slide so people don't have to keep looking at me. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so fear not. I'm just going to have some photos up that I forwarded to them. So they'll be just kind of a hodgepodge of photos that maybe give you an overview of our farm and something nice to look at. But I was really pleased when they asked me to be a part of this series today, because I'm always enthusiastic about pollinators. We got our land at the end of 2002. My husband and I wanted to do a farm-based business together. We didn't know what it was, just that we would do things organically, and that we wanted to do some sort of finished high quality product. So we landed on doing apples for ciders. And when I say ciders, I mean the fermented kind, what some in America have to call hard ciders. And you make it like a wine. So we invested ourselves in getting trees. Actually, we had to make the trees because they weren't sold commercially in the US, English and French apples with tannins. But apples need pollination, just like most horticultural products or horticultural crops, and also just hay crops and most so many different things need pollinators. And there are a broad range of things that Laura's going to talk about next. So we really wanted to enhance the ecology of our land. And it was just a lovely landscape with a lot of diversity, woodlands, and we have springs and that lead into a creek and a beautiful sedge meadow. And we had rented crop ground. So we took 30 acres of that crop ground and actually put it into a high quality prairie. And that is, we started that effort, I think it was back in 2006 or 7. Maybe 2008. But it's been an ongoing effort. Alicia mentioned many of the things that I've done to enhance pollinators, and it really paid off this year. So this is a picture of the orchard now, and we have about 16,000 trees, moving to about 18,000 trees. They're on about 18 acres of our 166 acre property. So it's not all apples at all. We have, as I mentioned, 60 acres of woodlands, 30 acres of prairie, plus all kinds of other smaller acreages that we enhance native plants and flowers in. But that also includes within the orchard itself. And you can go to the next slide. I tell people that dandelions are my friends, and even creeping Charlie, which homeowners with lawns just usually are always trying to get rid of. But they really make nice resources for our wild pollinators and any honeybees that might be out early in the spring. So a really key thing is to have resources from April through October. You might have heard of Appleton, Wisconsin starting No Mow May. So don't mow your lawns or your property in May, but we really have to think, which is great. It's building so much awareness, but we really have to think even beyond that to April through October. So we are fortunate to have a lot of clovers. There's just a lot of clover in Wisconsin, since that was a crop also for dairy cows before there was alfalfa. But we've also put this pollinator habitat that we've been encouraging on all of our property really came into play this year. And that was because, if you recall, we just had this kind of long, ugly spring. The weather was just sort of miserable many days. And then all of a sudden, in mid-May, we just got into the 90s. You can go to the slide of the pears. or it's a video actually. Hopefully it'll show, but our pears went into bloom first. And I walked out there and I was just amazed at, I don't know if you can see these little darty things in the sky, but those are wild bees that are just all over those pear blossoms. So I thought, great, our pollinators are at work. And then we started, you can go to the next slide. We started seeing buds in other trees. So it starts like this. And it just kind of was very slowly at that stage before it went to this, the next slide. And that's where they burst open and blossoms. This is a red fleshed apple variety we grow that's pretty uncommon, but we make a rosé cider. So we want that, the apples really give us a nice red juice for that. And then we went to this. You can go to the next slide. So within just a few days, we had most of our orchard, or I should say at least half of our orchard in bloom, all of my early season varieties. And I was thinking, I haven't noticed the honeybees. There's a beekeeper that sets up on a farm across the road from us. He knows we've got some good resources here. So he strategically places those bees over there to also benefit from our land. And I thought, well, I just haven't seen those this year. And I think we're going to need them because everything is blooming very fast in the 90-degree heat. And it could be done within a few days versus 7 or 10 days. So I contacted him and he said his bees were still in Texas. So no honeybees from him for me this year. And I thought, okay, it's up to the wilds. And we were having a massive bloom this year. It was actually going to be too many apples. So I was thinking of trying to thin blossoms so the trees weren't overburdened with apples. But I just thought, well, maybe I don't do that and leave it up to the natives. And I am happy to report that thanks to the wild bees, I do have apples on those trees this year. I was concerned because I thought I could see dandelions were just massive everywhere all of a sudden, and there was wild apple trees and other trees just blooming all over the rural landscape. So I thought, what's going to make them stay on my crop or come, for my apples? But having that habitat right there kept them there. So I'm really happy to report that this year. It's just like perfect timing for me to speak on this. You can show the next slide. But this is one of those honeybees. This is from a previous year because none of those flowers that you just saw in that previous picture were pollinated by a honeybee because they brought the hives into neighboring farms on Sunday and my trees were already past bloom. So they were 3 or at most probably 3 days only in blossom. So, but it does take conscientious work over time to have those kind of pollinator resources at hand. So I mentioned we have that 30-acre prairie. So the next slide shows just one slide of our burning it. In fact, we did that this spring. And you can go to the next slide. We also, we're finding that from the prairie, thanks to probably the birds, we're getting wildflowers growing within the orchard row. So that's what also helps keep the pollinators around is just having stuff right there in the orchard rows. And then what I have been doing this week is just mowing every other row. So between the trees, we have to mow it to keep. We also have rodents that want to eat the base of the trees, so we can't have everything long throughout the year. But what we do is we strategically mow so that we leave one row longer with flowering things like clovers and all kinds of diverse forbs while we mow the other row short. And then we just keep alternating like that until the fall. You can go to the next slide. But having these wildflowers also is just kind of like eye candy for us as we work in the orchard. That slide on the right with the purple is an aster, and those like to come in the fall. So that's one of our major flower species, and there's so many different colors and types of asters. And then also on the left is goldenrod, and that's loved by all kinds of pollinators, and honeybees really go after that. The other thing too is that being certified organic, I'm using materials that are approved by the National Organic Program. So that doesn't mean they are not toxic necessarily to insects, because there are some broad spectrum insecticides. There is one called Pyganic that is photodegrades very rapidly, and I will use that on only one of my 114 tree rows, only just like 1, 2, or 3 times at night, when the pollinators are not active, but the insect pest I'm after is active. It's nocturnal. So it just, I think growers really have to be, and landowners just have to be conscious of what they're doing and how it impacts your natives as well as your honeybees. And some growers, or a lot of growers, commercial apple growers, will bring hives into their orchard, and that's something we've never had to do. And I'm glad this year we really saw that we don't need to. And so I really like to try to get biology working for us, and that includes especially our native pollinators. Alicia, did I go over everything that you wanted me to cover on this?
You covered all of those questions beautifully, but I do have 2 questions with the time we have. We have just 3 minutes remaining.
Sure.
What advice would you give a woman landowner interested in promoting more pollinators on their property if they're just getting started?
Well, it's about habitat. So you have to look at what you have there and what you could have there. I mean, for us, we had 30 acres of crop ground that we were renting to somebody. So we used the NRCS, and you'll be hearing from Laura Jack Smith next. Of the NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's a USDA division. And and also the Farm Service Agency of the USDA, Department of Agriculture, that is. The various programs they have, like the Farm Service Agency helped us get that crop ground into prairie. And then we've used different programs like EQIP. We put in windbreaks to protect the orchard. And I worked with the NRCS and a nonprofit called the Xerces Society, because at the time the NRCS didn't have anybody like Laura. And so they didn't really know, but they wanted to learn about the pollinators. So the Xerces is very involved in invertebrate conservation. And so they could advise on what species we could put in that would also serve as windbreaks, but also just be something more desirable to our pollinators than perhaps some other species. So I think there's a variety of resources out there, but really it's got to be habitat and working on those flowers or getting things flowering from April through October. And Laura's going to go into more detail on that since she has the experience and background in that.
And with just 1 minute left, are there any concerns that you have regarding pollinators in the future, and any advice for folks to help us move forward in regards to those concerns?
Well, with our warming planet, 90, usually as an apple grower, we're worried about frosts. We had 3 frosts last year. And that's why we're having a bigger crop this year, because the apples will get biennial and want to produce every other year when they get shorted on a crop one year. And so we were thinking there's going to be a lot of flowers. And if I was dependent on honeybees and it's 90 degrees, the honeybees are going to be spending a lot of their resources just cooling the hive and keeping that queen cool. So, they're not going to be so busy in my orchard. But with the diversity of wild species, I mean, there's like 400 here in Wisconsin. You're going to find there are small little bees that you can't even hear working. When I first had blossom and a lot of blossoms, I walked down the tree rows and thought, I'm not hearing bees buzzing. Uh-oh. And then I had a wonderful crop of apples. It was thanks to those little guys. And then there's, the big brawny bumblebees that you just see out there working, whether it's windy, rainy. Honeybees like it pretty nice. They're not going to be out there in the heat, and they're not going to be out there in the cold and the wind and the rain. So having these diverse species are really, really necessary.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I am going to turn things back over to Kirsten as we can move along. Thank you, Deirdre, so much.
Thank you, Deirdre. If you have questions for Deirdre, make sure to put those in the chat, and we'll make sure to ask those at the very end of our program. Or if you just have questions for others in the room, make sure to add those to the chat as well. At this time, I'm very pleased to introduce Laura Jack Smith. As an agro and ecosystem ecologist, Laura strives to advance the conservation and ecological enhancement of our natural and agricultural resources. Laura's current professional experience includes serving as a biologist and the Wisconsin NRCS pollinator liaison with a nonprofit pollinator partnership. She assists with the development of informational and educational materials on establishing pollinator habitat and provides support to landowners, NRCS staff, and their partners on projects related to the implementation and evaluation of pollinator habitat and practices. She holds a degree in natural resources from Northland College and graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. During her free time, Laura loves gardening, cooking, and hiking, and can often be found outside raising her 2 young children on the land. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I am going to start sharing my screen. Right. And can I get a thumbs up? Does that look good?
We can still see the full slide deck.
Ah, there we go.
Looks great.
All right, there we are. Thank you. All right. Well, yes, thank you for that introduction, Kristen, and thank you to Deirdre. I love hearing about your farm, and I just hope someday I can come see it because it just sounds absolutely beautiful. And I have no doubt that you could also, Deirdre, you could give this presentation as well, because I think you know just as much or more than I do about pollinators with all the work and experience you've been doing. So. But yes, I'm really happy that I was invited to speak today because this is stuff that we love to talk about, and working with NRCS now, we're really focusing on how to work with producers and work in an agricultural setting. So as Kristen mentioned, I work with Pollinator Partnership, and I'm their NRCS pollinator liaison, where I help support landowners, NRCS staff, and NRCS partners. And also I wanted to wish everyone a happy Pollinator Week. This has been a really busy week for me. It's actually International Pollinator Week this week. So this is perfect timing for this webinar. All right, so just to kind of give you a quick quick agenda schedule of what we're doing today. I'm going to talk a little bit about why pollinators are vital to our ecosystems, how to identify some of the pollinators on your land, how to increase pollinators and their habitat on your land, and then go very briefly over some of the Farm Bill programs that can help support your goals. And then, of course, hopefully leave some time for questions. All right, and before I launch into the rest of the presentation, I need to take a moment to tell you a little bit about Pollinator Partnership, or P2 as we call ourselves. P2 is a science-based nonprofit conservation organization with the goal of providing protection for pollinators and their ecosystems. So we provide individuals and groups with tools and knowledge needed to assist them in their goal of supporting pollinators in their own communities. And through all of our collaborations with partners and volunteers, we've helped to create and enhance tens of thousands of acres of pollinator habitat already. And I would also like to mention that P2 has a whole lot of programs and resources available to you, from different technical habitat creation guides, different educational programs, and we also have good steward incentive and recognition programs to recognize those who are doing their part to protect pollinators. And all of these can be found at our website at pollinator.org. So I encourage all of you to check out our website at some time when you find the time. Okay, so to understand more about why we promote pollinator habitat, we have to understand why pollinators are so important to our planet. Well, pollinators provide pollination services for about 90% of the flowering plants on Earth. So that's a lot. And most of our plants, and about 1/3 of the world's food crops. And so what exactly do we mean by pollination services? It's kind of a quick review of biology. Most plants require pollen dispersal to reproduce. And plants have developed several different mechanisms for that. Some use animal vectors like pollinators. Some use self-pollination or wind or water, but most plants require that animal vector or pollinator to move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part, resulting in fertilization and the creation of a seed. So through pollination services, we are able to reap the benefits of the fruits, seeds, and oils that are produced by plants and their relationship with pollinators. Pollinators get the essential nutrition they need, just like us. They need sources of protein, carbohydrates, amino acids, and vitamins. And they can get all of this from the pollen and nectar that plants provide. And in return, the plants get their pollen moved for continued reproduction. So it's been estimated that about 1 of every 3 bites of food a person eats can be traced back to animal pollinators. So the health of our pollinators is directly related to the health of our food supply. In agricultural systems, healthy populations of pollinators increase production overall. Healthy pollinators will increase yields. Studies show that when you have healthy pollinators, you have improvements to the abundance, size, and quality of fruits of your crop. And the United States and truly the whole world relies on our pollinators to feed us. About 25 billion worth of US products are pollinated by the bees, butterflies, beetles, ants, and flies. And native bees can do up to about 30% of our pollination needs if we provide the habitat that they need. And Deirdre's example is just absolutely perfect for explaining this, and it's, actual evidence that, that's true. And in natural systems, wildlife food sources increase with biodiversity of both plant and insect communities, and that's closely correlated with the presence of pollinators. Pollinators increase biodiversity by helping plants to reproduce, and then these plants support a broad array of species and provide critical habitat for other animals. So pollinators are really the base of a lot of food webs and should be considered keystone species. They help create food, and they also are food themselves too. In a study of Carolina chickadees, they found that just one brood had more than 5,000 insects just to raise them. So that's a whole lot of squishy little caterpillars that have to be found in order to raise just one little brood of chicks. So it just goes to show that our food webs, our wildlife, all the way up the food chain is really dependent on our pollinators. And pollinators all help regulate the climate by sustaining vegetation. They're the ones that are continuing the reproduction of vegetation, and vegetation is what really regulates our climate. So they're really one more tool that we have for regulating climate change. All right, so despite how essential our pollinators are, we are facing unprecedented rates of insect loss across the world. Long-term studies are showing that some areas have staggering loss of insect numbers and diversity over the last 30 to 40 years. It's been in the literature for a while now, and can be a little bit depressing, honestly. About 28% of our bumblebees are declined, 19% of US butterflies are at risk of extinction, 50% of leafcutter bees species are at risk, 27% of mason species are at risk. You hear about the monarch butterfly all the time in the news. Over the past 20 years, they're suffering population declines of about 90%. Honeybees, which are critical to agricultural production, are suffering steep annual winter losses that put enormous strain on beekeepers. So, and bumblebees are being listed on the endangered species list. It's the populations there's a lot of them that are in peril. So why are pollinator and insect populations in such a deep decline? Well, it's really a complex soup of various stressors, but it can be summarized in what we refer to as the 4 Ps. So and this is the biggest one, the loss of pasture, or basically their loss of habitat. And that's just because of increase in monocultures, urbanization. If they don't have forage and nesting sites, then they don't have a habitat anymore. So the primary loss is just from their loss of habitat. And then there's also the pressure of climate change. There's, and this is again, Deirdre's example this year is really good. And sometimes there's just a mismatch between when things are blooming and when the insects are emerging or when they're available. So all the different climate change that we've been experiencing can really kind of offset those cycles. Pesticide misuse is also a big one. And also parasites. As honeybees are being moved around the entire country, they're being trucked all over for their pollination services. And so parasites and viruses and different diseases have really increased over the years and has become a major reason, a big pressure on the pollinators. And then you get all the interactions between all these pressures, and that creates even more declines. All right, so who are our pollinators? Who is it that we're talking about here? Animal pollinators include a whole lot of insects, of course, your butterflies, underappreciated moths. They never get enough, as much attention as they should. There's a lot of beetles that actually are pollinators, flies, not house flies, but creatures like bee flies are one of my favorite because they look like giant tiny flying teddy bears. Bats do a lot of pollination services, a lot of our tropical fruits. Hummingbirds and even some mammals are pollinators. So we usually think of insect pollinators here in Wisconsin, but if you think worldwide, there's really a diverse amount of animal pollinators around the animal kingdom. But of course, bees are our biggest pollinators, are the most efficient ones. And there are so many different types of bees. There's bumblebees, mason bees, carpenter bees, leafcutter bees. They are definitely the most important pollinator. And the unique thing about bees is that they are florivores. So both the adults and larvae feed on products of the flower. So if you think of like Lepidoptera, like moths and butterflies, their larva host feeds on leaves, like on the foliage of a plant. But bees require the nectar and pollen through their entire life cycle. Their bodies have pollen collecting structures, which makes them pollinating superheroes. They have a body shape or tongue that makes them really efficient in pollinating certain crops. Like blue orchard bees can pollinate an entire apple orchard in less time than honeybees. And I like how Deirdre mentioned how honeybees are, they require kind of particular circumstances. They don't like it when it's too hot. They don't like it when it's too cold. They don't like to get up too early. Where our native bees, there's just such a diversity of them. And so they really are able to be out and about in all different types of weather. All right, so biodiversity is really key when it comes to our chances of having stable and resilient pollination services. If one species is having a bad year, then there are other ones that are having a good year. Or if your honeybees are still in Texas, then you can have other native species that are around. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about identifying pollinators on your own land. And there's certainly not a need to do this. You can increase your pollinator populations, create habitat, and not know anything about insect ID, and that's totally okay. There's no need to do it, but I would definitely encourage you to try it. There's so many different pollinators out there, I kind of dare you to not get interested in identifying them on your land once you start attracting them. Just like so many things, once you start looking and you start noticing things, you start noticing even more. And that kind of reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by the late Jacques Cousteau: people protect what they love. So as you start spending more time noticing the features and characteristics of insects, you're going to be able to identify more, know more about them, and you're going to fall more in love with them and want to protect them even more. And I'm not going to lie, it's not an easy venture. I purposely put up a picture here on the left of this queen bumblebee flying out of view. I did not get a good picture of it. It can be hard to identify them. It can be hard to get pictures of them. I am not an entomologist. I actually have a background in more soil biology. But just like identifying plants, you can spend a lifetime working on insect and pollinator identification. Luckily, we have professionals who do this. Sometimes it requires a microscope to identify necessary features of insects, so you're definitely not going to be able to identify everything. And luckily, we have folks like PJ over at the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab to help identify things if you really need to, but you can definitely start picking up on a lot of things. So these pictures I have right here are some of my own pictures. I just have my iPhone camera and I know nothing about photography, but I'm having a great time out there anyway, learning about bees. So like I said, once you start looking, you'll be really surprised how much you find. Last year I was and all you had to do is sit down and watch your flowers, like just sit and watch for a while. I just watched for 10 minutes, some marigolds and sweet peas that I planted in a little side garden. Didn't see much of anything. There were some Japanese beetles on them. And then I sat and watched a New England aster for 10 minutes, and there were over 6 species of native pollinators that came by. And so it really doesn't take long. Like if you just sit and watch some, especially native plants, they will be there. All right, so there's a whole lot of tools to help you learn about pollinator ID to help you get started. I love this new bee guide that P2 put out, this bee identification guide. It's kind of like a good beginner way to get started, talk about the different parts of the bee, the head, the thorax, the abdomen, and then the different groups of bees. So this is available on our website. It's just a really handy guide to kind of get you started. And then the Seek app, I'm sure a lot of you know this already or even might use it already. The Seek app by iNaturalist is my new favorite tool. It's my new best friend. I use it a lot. It's not perfect. I catch some mistakes once in a while, like with the plants, because I know plants a little bit better. Once in a while it catches the wrong thing, but it is very good. I just am amazed that it's kind of funny. I feel like we get to cheat now. Back when I started learning ID, I got out my dichotomous key, my field guides. It was a lot harder now. So we get to cheat now using these apps like this. And then the WisconsinPollinators.com website, they have some really cool resources, just tons of information. They have a neat caterpillar ID guide, which is really fun they're a little bit easier to ID because luckily they kind of stay still. If you can find them, so they're really camouflaged sometimes, or sometimes not, but it's a little bit easier to ID those because they don't move quite as fast as bees. Then, of course, UW Extension has some great resources, like their Wisconsin Bee Identification Guide is another good way to get started. The Wisconsin Wild Bee Guide, put out by folks at the Groton Lab at UW-Madison, is really great. Some Facebook groups are really good. I joined the Wisconsin Bumblebee Observers Facebook group, which is actually run by one of the volunteers at the Bumblebee Brigade. And so in that Facebook group, people post pictures, and some of the more experienced folks, help you ID. But some of these citizen science projects, like the Bumblebee Brigade and the Wisconsin WiWiC app, these are ways to collect data and help these monitoring projects. And it's just a great way to learn as you're collecting data for science. So there's a lot of great resources that they have and a lot of great helpers. So I encourage you all to check those out if you're interested. Okay, so I'm going to kind of give you a little crash course in how we identify our pollinators. I'm going to have to go through this kind of quick so I don't run out of too much time here. So basically what you got to do is look at these different features like their antenna, the length, shape, and position. That gives you differences between butterflies and moths. Their antennas have different shapes. Same thing with bees, long antenna, short antenna. Wings are a really good characteristic to tell apart flies versus bees, or hear a skipper versus a butterfly. And also their like how hairy their body is. That can really, like the carpenter bees don't have a hairy abdomen. There's just all these little characteristics that, once you start picking up on them, they kind of start jumping out at you a little bit more. So one of the first things to do is start differentiating between flies, wasps, and bees. So flies have short antenna, only one pair of wings, and they have these huge eyes. But there's a whole lot of bee mimics out there. So a lot of times people will think that bees are bees because they have those yellow-black stripes. But there's a lot of them that are bee mimics and they're actually flies. So the easy way to tell is by usually the size of their eyes and that they only have one pair of wings versus two. And so your bees are going to have the two pairs of wings. They have pollen carrying structures. And the behavior is one, like, what do I mean by behavior? Well, they are florivores, right? So they're only going to be eating pollen and nectar. So if you see something that looks like a bee, but it's eating another insect, that's a tip right there. It's not a bee, it's a bee mimic. Same thing with flies. So you have, with wasps. You can look at their behavior to kind of see what's, some wasps are predators. They also collect nectar sources too, but that's a really good way to start differentiating them. And then moths, butterflies, skippers, looking again at their antenna is one of the main reasons that you can tell them apart. Their behavior, butterflies are usually out during the day, moths are out at night. And there can always be exceptions, of course. There's always exceptions in nature, right? So right here we have a clearwing moth. They are actually out during the day a lot. And this is this one down here on the left here. That's a fuzzy little bee fly. They are flies, even though they're really fuzzy, and they, like I said, look more like a teddy bear. And then this one right here might throw a lot of people who think, oh, that's a bumblebee, right? Bumblebee? It's not a bumblebee, it's a robber fly. You can see it is eating another insect, so it's not a bee. But there's so it's, anyways, you can really get into it, and it just is tons of fun. So I'm going to keep kind of speeding through this because I don't want to get too short on time here. I want to get to other stuff. But these are some of the major bees that you will, the most common ones, of course, the honeybee, the light brown body, the heart-shaped head. You want to look for flat back legs and a pollen basket. And they move along very quickly. They never spend much time on one flower. Bumblebees have that big bulky body. They are definitely out in cooler, cloudy weather. They're not so picky when it comes to when they're out and about. And they have that pollen basket on their hind legs. And then mining bees, these are ones that I've really started taking note of. You can kind of see there's distinctive line of hairs along the inside edge of their eyes, kind of looks like little eyebrows. So they are just so cute. And they're out very early, March to June. And then sometimes they kind of go away, but, and they carry pollen in their armpits. So they're, in early spring is the best time to find them. And then there's sweat bees. These are often the, some of the really tiny ones and some of the most beautiful ones, that bright metallic green, all these different colors. They're kind of more slender, and they're short tongue, so they're usually on the type of flowers that have like are more of a shallow flower. Carpenter bees sometimes get a bad rap, but they are amazing native bees, and they can be pretty big. The difference between bumblebees is that they don't have that as much fuzz on them. And the small carpenter bees, there's just tons of these. Like if you watch dandelions or something in spring, you're probably seeing a whole bunch of little small carpenter bees. There's just tons of, these little black bees. And here where it's like, oh, people don't think of that as a bee. Where's the yellow black striping? But sometimes they're all black, and there's a whole lot of them out there. All right, so there's a whole lot of resource available on that, and so I'll leave it there, but so I want to get to some of the different conservation practices. So when we think about what can we do now that we love all these species, right? Aren't they so cute? What can we do to promote their populations? How can we increase their numbers? Well, the good news is that conservation techniques really do work. The science is showing that, these practices that we do are working. Well, there's 3 simple things you can do. Keep the natural habitat you already have, enhance habitat in the other areas of your farm, and reduce the use of pesticides. Okay, so keep what you have. There are likely lots of places on your property that already have pollinators. Woody areas, buffers, roadsides, windbreaks, these are all pretty good pollinator habitats already. So you kind of work with what you have. And some of the things that you can do is limit mowing of the ditches and roadsides, keep grassy areas, only mow them once a year, leave some patches unmowed, things like that. Keeping dead trees, standing snags, all those sorts of things are really important for habitat. And that is because about 90% of our bees are solitary, and of that 90%, 70% are ground nesting and 30% are cavity nesting. So bees really need those cavities, those old standing snags, wood piles, things like that are all really important nesting sites for our solitary bees. Rodent dens and things like that, bumblebees will often take over. And also just having some bare patches of soil, pithy stems are really important. Leaf litter, just having these natural areas. You don't have to do much. It's almost like don't do something, don't do anything, and that will be some good nesting habitat. So just keep some of the natural areas you already have as long as there are no invasives there. And reducing tillage is a big thing because, as you can imagine, here's a picture of a big, from the surface just looks like a little tiny hole, but underground there's this big extensive cavity of tunnels. So not tilling helps maintain or helps create habitat for bees, leaving your standing stems, things like that. All right, and pollinator habitats can be created and enhanced. That's the other big strategy. And I want to emphasize how a site assessment will really help you decide what habitat to create or enhance. Oftentimes creating habitat, pollinator habitat, is kind of synonymous with a prairie restoration, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a prairie. Pollinator habitat is positioned broadly across the landscape to all different types of native habitats. And so to really restore at the highest level, you want to create something that's relevant to the landscape that you're in. So maybe it doesn't make sense to put a prairie in. Maybe it makes more sense to, expand the woodland edges that you have, things like that. It's really important to connect habitat fragments because that's one of the reasons why we have so many population problems is that they just don't have enough habitat. Patches are better than nothing, but sometimes just, connecting habitat that's already there is important. Using seed compositions to accommodate the existing pollinators that are there makes a lot of sense. And you definitely don't want to bite off more than you can chew because you want to take care of invasive species. You have the mowing management, prescribed fire, all those different things. So whatever it is that you're doing, if you're creating and enhancing habitat, you want to make sure that you're meeting pollinator basic needs. Pollen and nectar from early spring to late fall, places to nest, lay eggs, and overwinter, and provide protection from pesticides. So the foraging resources, as we've kind of mentioned already, in Wisconsin, you need something blooming from March through October is ideal. March seems so early, but there are queen bumblebees out in early March. Sometimes, some years it's possible even the very end of February, but they are out very early looking for nectar sources to start their nest. So anytime you can we like to say have at least 3 different blooming species at any given time from about March through October. So the more you can do, the better, but having at least 3 per bloom period is ideal. And then having a diversity of floral shapes, colors, sizes, and heights. All the different diversity of bees out there, they have different lengths of tongues. So they use different flowers depending on how far away the nectar source is for them. So just having a wide diversity is going to attract more different types of pollinators. And then keeping in mind that a lot of our pollinators require a host plant for their larval stage. And so providing nectar resources is really important, but a lot of our native plants, you don't really think of them as nectar sources, but they're really important for the larval host. So different grasses, forbs, and shrubs and trees are host to a whole lot of different native pollinators in their larval stage. And then you definitely want to protect your habitat from pesticide exposure. Here's a picture of, it's kind of hard to see, but some willows that the leaves are all curled because they got hit with some drift from pesticides. So using a non-flowering buffer between habitat and cropland is important, and we really encourage the use of IPM, integrated pest management strategies. And I just want to emphasize that there's a whole lot of different things you can do. The windbreaks, buffers, wildflower strips. You definitely don't have to just go with the prairie. There's a whole lot of different things you can do. And I'm just noticing the time. So this I'm going to have to breeze through. Reducing pesticide use could really use a whole hour on just this. So I'm just going to touch on it super briefly, but herbicides, eliminate a lot of the forage and host plants that pollinators need, and insecticides can be lethal, but even if they're not lethal, they can still affect the way that pollinators forage and reproduce and just the general long-term health of them. So it's really important to follow best management practices for best pesticide use on the farm, and just keep in good communication with your neighbors. DACCAP has this really neat drift watch service where it just helps farmers and those with pollinator habitat and pollinators communicate with each other of when there's going to be a spray. And of course, we understand that sometimes pesticides are just a necessary part of agriculture. And so we really encourage the use of IPM strategies. There's a lot of different ways besides spraying to control pest populations using different biological control methods and modifying your cultural practices to keep on top of pests. And P2 has a whole bunch of resources on this. Some of these are brand new, like the apple and cucumber crop guide for protecting pollinators on pesticides. So that's something I encourage you to check out if you'd like more information on protecting pollinators from pesticides. Okay, so the Farm Bill programs, this is something that you'll want to not worry too much about the individual programs and the purpose and things like that. This is a kind of a table to kind of help you reference like what sorts of program might work for you, but don't get too worried about the details because you don't have to know what program you want to apply for before you go in to your NRCS office, because they will help you figure that out. But so that it's set up so that there's programs available for people who are currently in production, who are just beginning. If you're looking for set aside land to retire, kind of, that CRP retirement program, there's a lot of different ways to have support on your pollinator habitat and practices. Is a pretty simple 5-step steps to assistance. You want to first go with your planning, and then they will help you get through the application. You'll find out if you're eligible, and then they go through a ranking. And that's where sometimes people don't know that just because you apply doesn't mean that you will get funded. But the ranking happens a couple times a year, and there's always rolling applications, so you can apply anytime you'd like. And then there's the implementation. So you could apply, and if you decide you don't want to implement it, you don't have to. You can go through, all 4 steps and just kind of wait and see if you still want to do it. And so some of the different practices, like conservation cover, you can get help with cover crops to establish seasonal cropland. It doesn't have to be prairie. Again, it's great if you have the time and space to do prairie. But sometimes you only have time for like a season or two, and there's a lot of different cover crops that are great pollinator plants. Riparian forests, shrub and tree planting, those are super important resources. A lot of times our trees and shrubs are the early blooming species that our pollinators need. And there's also help with forage harvest management, prescribed grazing, things like this. So I guess I just want to encourage everyone to think beyond just a prairie. That's some of our best pollinator habitat, but there's so many different ways that you can include pollinator habitat on your land that works for you. So even if you just start thinking about it, I encourage you to contact your USDA service center. The folks there, from what I hear, are always very happy to work with people who are doing pollinator habitat. It's one of their favorite things to do. So even if you're not sure exactly what you want to do yet, I just encourage you to contact them and start talking about it. And I'm also available for that too. If you want to just talk about what your conservation goals are, what sort of things you're thinking, I'm happy to talk with you about that as well. And I have, we're working in 7 different states. I have 7 counterparts in the Midwest and then also in California. And the Bee Friendly Farming Program is a certification program that P2 is doing that gives recognition to farmers who are doing these pollinator practices. So if that's something you're interested in, I encourage you to look that up as well. And then I encourage everyone to take the communication survey put out by the North American Pollinator Group. They are trying to understand more about what educational resources we need out there to help people know more about pollinators and putting in pollinator habitat. So I'm sorry, I kind of rushed through the last slides there, but I wanted to make sure that we have some time for questions. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. There was a ton of really amazing information, and we'll be sharing this out afterwards. The recording, once it's ready, will be up on our website. Because we're right at the hour, I just want to quickly mention that if you're interested in more WiWiC events, those are all up on our website. If you're interested in also figuring out how to implement some of the things that Laura talked about and that Deirdre talked about, you can email us at info@wiwic.org, and then we can talk with you about what your goals are, and then kind of direct you to the right person to make sure that you kind of are getting what you need. We will officially be ending it here, but we'll be taking some of the questions that we got earlier and sending them out to our listserv. So if you want to join that, you can also join our listserv and send an email again to info@wiwic.org, and you can get added to the listserv. We'll be answering some questions on that platform, but we'll also have some time now to go through some of those questions that we got earlier and just cover them and see what Deirdre and Laura think. So folks so first, thanks everybody for joining. For those of you who need to leave, feel free to hop off. We'll see you on the next one.